Good morning to everybody. Thank you for joining us on this Tuesday morning from wherever you are from across the continent. I just want to have the short honor of welcoming our training facilitator for this morning, Marcel Rossouw. Marcel has been active in the digital design and communication industry for the last 24 years. Over the last 7 years, he has been dedicating his time to building Accenture's design and innovation capability across South Africa under the globally recognized brand Fjord. And Marcel, please let me know if I pronounced that correctly. It's with a J, Fjord. His passion lies his passion lies in the field of design-led strategy and related methodologies and fostering of innovation, digital transformation, and the design leadership within large institutions. I have the great honor of welcoming Marcel Rossouw. Take it away, Marcel.
Thanks, Golo. And may I say, it's my privilege to be able to present to you guys today. And hello to all the hackers out there. I hope you guys are making some good progress. Please excuse all the huddy-dudds in my in the vicinity. They can get a bit noisy. I've also got my cat with me. So there's a lot of other activity in the vicinity that may occur occasionally during the course of the session today. But I hope you guys are making good progress. I'm aware of the fact that you guys are 1 week in. And I hope that the session today is helpful in guiding you or providing some guidelines in taking a human-centered design approach to your respective streams. Golo, are you happy for me to share my screen now?
Definitely. Definitely.
Okay. Tell me when you can see, and then we can get going.
It's loading on my side.
Okay. Just a moment here. Looks like I need the audio.
I can see your screen. Can somebody else in the chat also just confirm if they are successfully seeing Marcel's screen? And just drop a message in the chat for us. Yes, Kiana has said thumbs up. So yes, Marcel, I think you've got green light to proceed.
Great stuff. I'm going to go full screen now. So, alrighty. Great. Well, today, as you may know, is one of two sessions. It's a 2-hour session that's going to cover the first half of your typical design thinking methodology, and I'll quickly cover what the difference is between human-centered design and design thinking in the intro. And I'll give you a brief breakdown of the agenda in a moment. But first of all, welcome. I hope, again, that this is useful and you guys find it interesting. I'm going to leave some time in the middle and towards the end of the session for some questions, if you guys have any. And I hope that there is some provocative content and things that spur some questions in you, or inform, again, your approach to your how you tackle your specific challenges. Again, just a little bit about myself and my history. I've been a design practitioner since 1998. I have been, as Golo said, building the design capability for Accenture Fjord over the past 7 years. And the typical kind of design challenges that we've looked at has been very broad. And I want to quickly say that, you know, mindful that design is a very big topic. It's complex and there are very many different flavors of design. And so, you know, the exciting part of design is exactly that. And I truly believe that design can tackle very many different problems, especially if you look at the disciplines of design thinking and maybe the more abstract parts of design. The challenges that we tackled for our clients over the past has involved some really hard-nosed business problems, to taking a new product or service to market, to helping them understand how they engage their employees and train up their employees. And so, the problems that design can tackle can be broad and nuanced, and that's, again, the exciting part of the field. So I'm passionate about design and innovation, and what it can do for companies and for the world at large in helping people solve problems. And then I'm also a music fan. I love music, all kinds of music, and I play a bit of drums on the side. That keeps me sane, and it's always been a big part of my life. So with that said, I'm going to quickly go to the agenda itself. A brief intro, I think we've kind of covered that. I'm going to do a quick overview of design thinking and what that is, and then break it into the first two halves, divided by a tea break in between, and then we'll do a close and a Q&A. So a quick one, just keen to hear where everybody's from. If you don't mind, can you put in the chat window just where you guys dialing in from? I'm always curious to just know who's on the call, and that would be really cool if you can do that quickly. Not sure if I can see this chat window from here. Just hang on a sec. Can you see the chat window, Kolo?
Yes, I can.
Can you read out? I can't see the chat window.
So far, JHB, Parktown JHB, and Kiana says with the smiley face, Parktown JHB. Those are the two responses I have so far. Tony, where are you calling in from, Innocent? Spoon? Kempton Park.
Okay, cool. So
Yeah.
a lot of Joburg people. Well,
Yeah.
I'm dialing in from Parkwood, so I'm also in the Joburg area, as you may have deducted from all the Haridas flying overhead. Some lovely rains that we've had, so it's promising for a nice green summer. And I hope you guys are all well and in good health. So let's maybe jump straight into it.
Last one. We've got somebody from somebody originally from the DRC, but he's currently based in. He's a graphic designer currently based in Pretoria, South Africa. That's
Awesome.
Tony. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, welcome to everybody. Right. So maybe the first place to start is what's the difference between human-centered design and design thinking anyway? And let's keep it at that, because if you start looking at service design and business design and user experience design, we may be here for the next 3 days. So, but the focus of today is human-centered design and design thinking, and how does that help us in tackling problems? It's subtle, but I think it is significant to just talk about that and the differences. So human-centered design is an approach, and that's maybe the key word here. It's an approach to problem solving that obviously places the emphasis on focusing on understanding human behaviors and needs, pain points, and wants to inform that problem solving activity. And design thinking is a practical framework. It's the doing part of that, I guess, and how it comes to life in tending to creative problem solving and innovation. Of course, all design, in my view, I think should include some element of a human-centeredness. If we consider who we're solving for, it's critical that we empathize, and empathy is a big word in human-centered design and design thinking. We empathize with that person or persons that we solve for. We understand their needs and their worlds and what it means to be in their shoes. And that from that starting point is where we start solving problems or attending to. So what does it look like if if we start looking at it. The first thing obviously is that it's human-centered, and we'll look at a couple of approaches to how we step into the shoes of users, customers, groups, communities, whoever we're solving for, and evoking empathy and understanding their needs and their wants. The second part of it, component of it, is that it's iterative. What does that mean? It means that we from the outset say that we don't necessarily know the answer, but the whole purpose of the doing is iteratively moving towards clarity. And even then, iterating the whole time and reinventing or augmenting or changing, depending on how needs change and how people change and how our service or our product or whatever solution we're taking out there needs to change to adopt to changing environments and changing need states. And then very importantly is that it's collaborative. And I think this is where a key behavior for any designer or someone engaging in design thinking or human-centered design is to include other people in the solutioning. And that really means that it's not necessarily just designers or people that know about our field, but people that can contribute to it from various different viewpoints. And it is the power of bringing these different viewpoints together into a room and solving collaboratively that really makes things interesting and start adding different elements to the mix that probably would have given you a perspective that you wouldn't have had before and informed your solution in a way that you never thought would be possible. So collaboration is a very key part of it. And then also very important is a holistic approach. Now, what do we mean by being holistic? If, for instance, we are looking to solve for an individual or a couple of customers that we think is our target market or the people that we need to solve for, it's not enough necessarily to just think about their worlds or even the service or product that we're trying to bring to life, but also think about the people behind the scenes that help with taking that or making that service possible, but also the technology layers and even the business constraints or the processes. And in the case of government, maybe the bureaucratic protocols that enable or hamper us being able to solve for what we're trying to solve for. So taking a holistic view often means also zooming out and looking at the bigger picture, and zooming in to look at a specific moment or specific interaction or a telling piece of data that helps us to understand things a bit better. This zooming in and zooming out is a very key aspect of design. And in all aspects of design, whether you are designing a set of screens for an app, or you're designing a business process, or you're designing a chair, the habit and the behavior of zooming in and zooming out, looking at the holistic or the big view, and then zooming into key detail or key moments is a key behavior of design and doing design. Often we talk about these three things, and if you've been involved in design, you may have seen this before, and the three lenses that overlap when we consider what a solution should include. The first one is obviously our customer or our user, and what is desirable for them. What are their needs and their behaviors and their wants, and how do we solve for that? But the other parts that also play into it is viability, which speaks to the business objectives, imperatives, and what are we trying to do as a business or as an entity or as a governmental institution or as a library or as an archive, for instance. What is our business objectives? And then the other part is technically what is feasible. What can we actually do with the technologies, with the means that we have at hand? And these three overlap and then ultimately would inform what a solution should include. So again, it's not just looking at the user or the customer and what they need, but also including and considering what the business wants to achieve through this, and what is technically what's feasible, and what do we have available to us to make this new solution possible and enable it. So I'm going to go through a couple of things that typically also fall into its design thinking exercise or design thinking project. The first one that I want to mention is wicked problems. Again, if you've been involved in the area of design before, you may have heard this statement, but the wicked problem, and as it says here, is typically an area where it's not quite clear what the problem is. A lot of the times, our clients would come to us and say, well, you know, our customers aren't really engaging with us on the website, and we're seeing a fall in activity and engagement in taking on new services and products. We think our products are perfect for what they need, but we don't understand why people aren't just going through, completing the checkout process, for instance, in buying something. So scientifically, the process is perfect. There are no technical problems in terms of taking things from end to end and going through a checkout process. But there may be something abstract or related to people's behavior or understanding of what they're going through that may be influencing or hampering someone to go through a checkout process. And these kind of unknowns are what make typically a wicked problem fuzzy or hard to understand. And that is where design thinking and the use of design methodology helps us to interrogate these things with a different lens. The next one I want to talk about is patterns. So a lot of what we do, especially in the beginning and the research phase, is understand what are the patterns, the underlying themes and patterns that we see coming out of the research data. So through the interviews, through the content, the photos that we sometimes take, the observations that we make, we try to find commonalities, and those commonalities start to bubble up as themes or main things to solve for. And that's a very important part of design, is what we also sometimes call synthesis, or extracting or distilling these patterns and these themes that we can identify and highlight and say, these are the 5 or 6 things that we keep seeing in the data and the research, and that we know is important and should be part of our focus when we start solutioning. So patterns is a very important thing to look out for when you start doing research, looking at behaviors, and start collating all the research data. The next one I want to mention is modeling or mapping. So a lot of the sense making in design is about simplifying and making the key insights and behaviors tangible. And whether that is problem solving and looking at a customer journey and seeing how people move from the beginning to exploring options and getting to know a product, and then moving on towards buying that product and then eventually using it and upgrading or even leaving that service. That is typically a linear journey, and you may have heard of a journey map. And that kind of mapping and modeling is very much a key part of design. It's a way to make sense of and tell a story towards deeper understanding and insight. Again, once you've extracted the patterns, how can you start telling a story around it and make it tangible and make it meaningful so that people can look at it, understand what you're trying to tell, and see the highlighted areas that you're trying to solve for, and then towards the end state of your solutioning, see what solutions you are putting forward to help address those key moments. And there are different ways of mapping and modeling, which I'll get into a bit later. Then I think a key part of design is framing or reframing. If a frame is basically a point of view or a way of seeing something, reframing is a way of basically ideating or innovating around a certain point of view. If our traditional view of a car is that it's something that gets us from A to B, well, then our traditional view of a car is currently being changed quite drastically and would probably in 10 to 20 years time be totally different. I know that car manufacturers are looking at the inside of a car as potentially a space where people should be or will be engaged in other things other than driving. So the internal space of a car, you can almost see as being either built for entertainment or for work or for various other modes of engagement, because self-driving cars is going to allow us to do that. And how does that change the role of the automobile? So reframing is a very important part of innovation and ideation. If we know and we have a clear view of looking at the problem or the opportunity, and we've come to know that through our research, we've done the synthesis, we've seen the patterns, and we've highlighted that. How can we reframe that, bring other, I guess, elements or disruptive thinking to the mix that will help us see that in a new light and ideate around that opportunity or problem statement? And then again, ideation comes from reframing. Concept generation doesn't just happen in isolation. And I've always been a big proponent of doing the work up front that will allow you to make those leaps. I mentioned adductive reasoning here, and that's really speaking to the ability to make connections between A and B. I mentioned scientific reasoning or deductive reasoning, where it's very logical. You know, if A equals B and B also equals C, then it reasons that A equals C. That's a typical scientific hypothesis. But in fuzzy or wicked problems, we need to sometimes make leaps, and the ideation and content or concept generation starts from making these connections from different observations. And it's in the reframing and framing of what we see that we can start making these leaps and new connections between things. Right. So what does a typical design thinking process look like? Well, in essence, it's pretty much standard across the board. It doesn't really matter who is applying it, but it looks a little bit different. So I'm going to highlight 3 different articulations of the design or design thinking process, starting with Stanford D School. So Stanford D School has a 5-step process. It starts with empathizing with your with the person or persons or community that you're solving for, and that typically involves research. It involves going out there in the field, talking to people, understanding their needs, observing their environments, and I'll speak a little bit about that later. And then bringing it in back home, doing the synthesis, as I mentioned, which means like bubbling down the key themes that you're solving for, defining what the problem statement is, and then ideating around it. Once you've got a good idea of what the concept should include, prototyping that concept and testing it, critically testing it with whoever you're solving for, to make sure that the concept that you're coming up with actually resonates with and works in field in a real world scenario. And of course, this can be iterative in itself. So you might find that research goes into a definition stage. You got the problem statement down, but as you start ideating, you realize that that problem statement needs to be redefined. And then you iterate again, you inform your definition with some new research. Or you start prototyping and you realize that the prototype is not suitable for the solution that you want to take to market. And so your prototype, and especially in the prototyping stage, you start iterating. So it's not a pure linear cycle, and that at any stage, things can iterate or evolve depending on changing needs. But this is Stanford D School's articulation of the design process. Then you got IDEO, which really simplified it to quite an extent. But in essence, the main elements are still there. They call it discover, and you remember that Stanford D School called it empathize. We also called it discover at Fjord, but discover essentially again means research and really ramping up towards a lot of data that can help you ideate and narrow down what exactly the solution should include, and then finally prototyping and evolving that solution towards an ideal concept or product or service that you want to take to market. But the one that I like the most is the one that is defined by the British Design Council. So it's called the double diamond. As you'll see, that for obvious reasons, it's visually literally two diamonds or sitting next to each other. And again, it starts on the left-hand side with discovering what the data, what the research is telling us, taking that into, and by the double diamond also has function in that when we start discovering, we go very broad. So you'll start with a potential problem or opportunity you want to solve for. Go broad or go wide in terms of doing the research. And then in the definition stage, you converge, as they say, towards what exactly the problem statement is. So that first diamond really elegantly articulates what the process is. In the discover phase, you go broad and you look really wide, and remember the holistic stance in any design process. You go really broad in terms of looking at the research data, and then in the define stage, you narrow down again towards what the problem statement is. Then the second diamond is predominantly related to the ideation and creation phase. So again, you develop a whole set of ideas. You generate those ideas, as many as you can, based on the data that you're looking at, and then narrow it down to what the ideal solution would need to contain. So it's this model that I'll use for the next 2 days to kind of take us through the design process. And today we're going to be focusing on the first diamond, discover and define, and how does that play out. But really the double diamond's been around for a while and for good reason. And I think it is because it so eloquently brings all these elements together. Okay, so what do we do in each of those phases? I'm going to quickly just break it down, and we are going to get into more detail as the session progresses. But in a nutshell, during the discover phase, as I mentioned, here we're predominantly concerned with research. And that includes different activities. It includes going out into the field, observing people in either their natural environments, whether that's at home or at work, or going to school, or going to a library, or accessing an archive, or going to the shops, and seeing how they go about that, taking notes, taking photos, and then also interviewing. Interviewing plays a big part of what we do. A lot of the times it's not always possible to go out there in the field and observe people as much as we'd like to. And interviews really are helpful to get contextual information around how people perceive and feel about certain things, as particular areas that we're looking to focus on, whether that is the use of a service or everyday behaviors and habits. And then it can also include something like a content audit or even desktop research, which means gathering data online or looking at existing fields of data, large archives or data sets that would help inform our view of the world. In describe, as I said, we start synthesizing. We take all that research data. We try to see where the main themes are that are coming out, and for a primary reason to prioritize, to really distill down what we need to focus on in our solution. So the better our data is, the better our research data is, the better we will be able to focus on the right things when we go into solution mode. It's a critical stage of the whole process. Synthesis is almost where something, in my view, more often than not, either fail or succeed. Because if your research is not up to scratch, if the data you're looking at is compromised or has some gaps in it, the synthesis that you do, the conclusions that you make around what the key problems or opportunities are, will not be well informed. So it's critical that during the synthesis stage, you make the effort in really interrogating the data, make sure that you have the data in hand that'll enable you to make decisions, and then start making sense of it. That's the other part of describe, is making sense, or define, as we say, is making sense of what you're looking at. You are actually starting to articulate what you're looking at, and that's where a lot of the mapping and modeling comes in. So journey mapping, personas, as that I'll mention a bit later, these things help you start describing or defining what you're looking at. And then going into your concepts, that's where you start putting it into life. If you've created your maps, if you've created your personas, and you've described the problem or the opportunity, now you start really defining the solution itself. And that can be very broad in terms of how it's articulated. Sometimes it's a sketch. Sometimes it's a video that helps bring the concept to life. And even in our co-creative workshop, sometimes we use role-playing to start exploring how real-life scenarios would play out. Sometimes it's a set of screens. And also during this time, when we are solutioning, when we are creating concepts, is when we start also testing it with our customers or our end users and the people out there that we're solving for. So that ultimately, and what you see there is a term called MVP. MVP stands for minimum viable product. And what you're trying to do here is not solve for everything, but an MVP really is the minimum amount of things that you can take to market to solve for your end user. It's not putting everything in the bucket and going to market with it, because in practical terms, what we try to do with design thinking is solve for the core thing that we want to, and not go too broad. Because if you go too broad and you haven't really qualified what you're solving for, you're going to get stuck, and you're probably going to get the wheels spinning because you have too many things that you're trying to solve for. So an MVP definition is critical in honing down on the minimum viable product definition, or the minimum amount that you need to do to have success. And of course, in getting to an MVP definition, you need everybody's agreement on what's included in an MVP definition. And then finally, it's about validating and iterating through that solution, getting it out there, doing demos, sometimes with leadership or with your team, and going through an agile sprint cycle to take it to market. And in that sense, you're also constantly managing scope and managing any potential pitfalls or dependencies that you might not have known about or have seen initially. And then an ongoing process or iterative process of taking your solution to market. So in a nutshell, that's the double diamond process. And as I said, in the next 2 days, we'll take you through each of those phases and what exactly is involved in each. So that brings us to the first half of today. Insofar as the double diamond is concerned, that involves discover, or the research phase. Now, the first thing I want to just talk about in tending to discover, or that particular phase of the design thinking, is research. And what exactly do we mean by research? Again, some of these concepts may be familiar to some of you who have already done design and been involved in design exercises, but I think it's maybe useful to just quickly touch on qualitative versus quantitative research. So what you're looking at here is the average South African based on a couple of reports online. This is a few years ago, but still valid, and I think just showing you what we mean by quantitative data. This is all based on numbers, and it involves, if you look at this profile of a person, this person is, the average South African is between 25 to 34 years old, an urban black female, an LSM of 6. If you have done marketing, an LSM is basically a marketing term for income brackets and living standards. And then this person also probably has a Nokia Asha 210, which she uses to access the internet, and typically buys airtime at the spaza shop at 90 Rand per month. But it doesn't tell us much about the person itself. It may tell us about their gender, about their living standards and income bracket, their age range, and even more or less how much money she spends. It's quantitative data, but it doesn't tell us much about the person itself. And this is where qualitative research is so important. We need a voice and a face and a person behind that data that can inform us around how their attitudes, their stances are in general towards certain services or products. What are their habits? What do they like and dislike? And how does that inform the way they look at things? So what's important to note here is that quantitative data usually tends to rely on a lot of it. And what you'll typically find is people that rely on quantitative data, or the hard data, the numbers, like to have a lot of it to get to an average or a set of key insights based on those hard numbers. But what we do in qualitative research is that we usually say, if you talk to about 8 to 12 people around a specific topic, you'll usually start getting a lot of research insights around their particular behaviors and attitudes pretty quickly. And that, in fact, doing the research, the qualitative research, doing the interviews, observing people in their environments, actually allows you to get a lot of rich data with not necessarily the need to interview 150 people. What you'll tend to see is within the range, and again, this is a range, so it depends on the depth and the complexity of the problem or the opportunity you're trying to address. Typically, a range between 10 and 12 people will give you a good indication of their behaviors, their need states, and the way they typically approach the use of a service or a product. So we don't need as many people or as many data sets to start getting the patterns and the insights that we typically look for. Of course, it's always good to start doing research where you consider different locations, people's cultural backgrounds, and start breaking it down. And there's always a motivation to make for more research, I would say. But given time constraints, qualitative data can be really, really powerful if you limit and focus your attention in terms of your research effort on a few key profiles and individuals that you know will give you some good information around their interactions and behaviors and typical need states and stances towards a product and service. So in a nutshell, quantitative data is there to measure things for us and kind of give it a size, whereas qualitative data is there to help us understand what really is the driving force behind someone buying 90 Rands worth of airtime as opposed to 80 Rands worth of airtime, or why do they buy it on a Wednesday and not a Friday? You know, why is the usage higher in January or December as opposed to April? Or why has their usage suddenly spiked when previously they were only using 90 rands worth of airtime? Now suddenly they're using 180 rands worth of airtime. And it's only through qualitative research that you might come to the understanding as to why. And if we look at that hypothesis or that fictitious example, you know, it might be that they are sharing the phone with someone else, or that there's been a change in their lifestyle, in their life stage, and that they need more airtime. Or maybe they've gotten a new job. And all that's useful information for us to either help that person or make a better recommendation in terms of how our product or our service can fit better in their lives. But the quantitative data won't necessarily tell you that. The combination of the two, I think, is really powerful. And that's an important thing to say here. And what we typically finding more and more is, as we're working with our clients, there's a big focus on the hard data stuff. Everybody's trying to collect data around their customers and who they're serving. And then what we're trying to do, and with our artificial intelligence and data analyst colleagues, is we work very closely with them to try and bring qualitative and quantitative data together, overlay the two, and say, well, if the hard data is telling us this, what is the qualitative data doing in tandem, and how can the two together help bring us to a unique insight? So qualitative data usually involves different things. I mentioned a couple. We do a lot of user interviews. We do some contextual inquiry, and I'll touch on that in a moment. Sometimes we immerse ourselves within an environment, and we spend a lot of time in looking at that environment and how people move, use that space, which parts of that environment and of the technologies they're accessing in that environment are problematic or help them, and how do they augment that with their own tools and their own ways of getting about their day-to-day, which is often very instructive. We do a bit of focus groups time to time, but focus groups, in my view, can be problematic because you don't necessarily get always a clear and a pure voice. That voice is a collective voice, and as we know, collective dynamics can help or can hinder depending on the topic matter. And in a sense, invariably, you always have more dominant voices in focus groups, and in a sense, those voices can skew the results or the outputs of a focus group. And then, of course, we do a lot of competitive benchmarking and desktop research to see what's out there, what's best practice, and that informs also what we look at and how that can shape our solutioning. So I'm going to take just these three as by way of example and show you the subtle differences between user interviews, contextual inquiry, and ethnography. Typically, user interviews are conversational. It ends up being a discussion between the interviewee or the researcher and the individual or the participant. And we always make sure that we have scripts on hand that help guide the conversation and the kind of topics that we want to cover with the participant. And we always make sure that we annotate and record that session. But a key thing with user interviews is active listening. It really is an art form to maintain and conduct a conversation and an interview and make sure that one doesn't skew the conversation or lead it or dominate that conversation, but really sit back and actively listen to what the person is telling you. A lot of what happens in an interview or this kind of research interview is not always what is said, but how it is said. And it takes a trained or practiced ear to recognize when there's a moment to maybe dig deeper, or just to let something go. But the behavior and the speech patterns and the way someone tells a story is often a great indication of where there's an opportunity to find out more and maybe uncover a valuable nugget of information during that conversation. Contextual inquiry is what we often do when we go and visit offices, or in the case of Massmart and Macro, we visited the large Macro stores and walked around. And by the way, I find those large Macro stores super fascinating, because it's in essence a warehouse where there are still forklifts and things moving around. And it's also a store where people move around and you can basically buy anything. And in that instance, it's very much about observing how people go about their work and their day-to-day. We look at artifacts, and by artifacts, I mean forms, papers, typical things that people use to get the job done. And in many aspects, especially when organizations are looking to become more digital, the physical papers and documents are very often where we start and look at how much effort is spent on filling in a physical form or a paper document. Where does it get stored? And what is the effort required typically to get something through a process? We take a lot of photos, we take a lot of videos, and we also interview people in their environments. And then ethnography is a really immersive exercise. It involves a lot of journaling, and sometimes it's not always possible to do that in person. So ethnographic research often requires that we ask people to share their thoughts or their day-to-day behaviors and patterns in a journal, and then digitally capture that, or and then we check in with them on a regular basis. But ethnographic research really means getting to the crux of what people's cultural habits and behaviors are, and getting really immersed into their day-to-day, to the point where you know what their bathrooms look like or their kitchens look like, and what they eat in the morning. So not often do we get into ethnographic research, but when you're trying to understand cultural norms, small nuances around healthcare or family dynamics within a certain culture, ethnographic research, for instance, can be very, very helpful in that regard. So just 3 examples of how qualitative research can play out, and how typically you capture that or frame those exercises. So I want to quickly chat about how we get from raw research data to something that's really useful that we can start working with. At this stage, we are still dealing with the raw research, the raw data. But typically, what you want to do is move from the raw data to information, and information being meaningful data that you can look at and start informing your thinking. And then from that, move to knowledge, or what we call theories or hypothesis that's based on that information. So here you're already starting to look at what is a possible solution, or framing it within a story. And then ultimately that should lead to wisdom, or some kind of concept, or a way in which you can address something in a novel manner. But it starts with the raw data, and then there's a process of getting there. And we'll kind of start breaking it down throughout the course of the day and tomorrow, in how you get to that place where you can start making new connections and looking at things in a new or novel manner. One of the things to maybe just pause on is how to go about research. And it really is key to approach research with the right mindset and attitude. So here are three things that typically we like to do. We ask a lot of questions. We also look and observe, as I mentioned, and we like to try things. Trying and immersing yourself in what people do and trying to experience what they experience on a day-to-day basis is super critical to get a first-hand account of what it means to make use of a service or to struggle with something like diabetes. It means being immersed in someone's environment and experiencing, if not in place of them, right next to them, or doing some role playing and even using props to sort of get into their shoes. But let's start maybe with asking questions. I think it's important to develop a rapport when you start with any interview. And this means understanding where that person is coming from. It's very often the case that when we start an interview, we don't start with what we're trying to find out. The first thing that we do is try to get to know that person a little bit better. What's their background? Where did they grow up with? Or where did they grow up, and how did they, in a sense, get to where they are today, or just develop some kind of understanding of the person themselves. And then it's important for them to allow them to tell their story. A lot of the time, one has to be very cognizant of your own biases, your own predispositions when you go into an interview situation. Because all those things inform your view of what you're hearing and could even taint the research that you get out of that session. So active listening is a key component to it, and then it's always about asking why. And as I said, there are instances or moments in an interview where you would intuitively know to dig a bit deeper, and that's where asking why is a very useful tool, not just once, but sometimes even 5 times to get to the real reason as to why someone behaves or chooses to behave in a certain way. And then I spoke about zooming in and zooming out. We like to go into interviews with the notion of getting someone's understanding or their behaviors or attitudes towards the larger topics, and then also trying to capture key detail around their specific behaviors or idiosyncrasies when using a product or service. Then moving on to looking or observing, I think it's important to have a beginner's mindset. And in this instance, again, being cognizant of your own biases when looking at something or observing someone in their environment, observing with all senses, understanding, for instance, not just what this person's desk looks like or how their work surface or work area looks like, but mindful of their position in an office environment and what other movement and activity is around them that informs or hampers them from doing their work. And it sometimes takes time. What I've found is that in previous research projects, we've had to go back twice or even 3 times to get more and get the right data that would help us form the bigger picture. And then lastly, as I mentioned, it's important to try, and by try, I mean really try and get a hands-on feel for what that person is experiencing, step into their shoes. And as I mentioned, in some of our workshops, we use props and role-playing to enact a situation or try and understand how certain situations play out. So I just want to mention a couple of things that we typically take into a research process. This is a stock standard one, and one that we always write up just before we go into a research session. It's called a consent form for good reason, because you need to obviously have that person's permission to use their data and the conversation in your research, but it's also important to explain to them what the reason is for the interview, so that you can put them at ease, and let them know that their data won't be shared outside of the research project that you're busy with. It won't be shared with third parties, and that at any given time they can opt out. So that puts them at ease. It gives them a sense that you are responsible with their data, and that this is not just to be sold on to another third party, but it's solely for the purposes of research, and that again, they have the freedom to opt out if they want to at any given time. And then the incentive form is an interesting one. Many times, you want to reward the person for spending 2 hours with you and sitting with you and talking to you about their lives and their particular behaviors or patterns around usage of a service or product. But it gets contentious if people are waiting for, or with the expectancy of getting a reward, would potentially look to tell you what you want to hear. So, and that's obviously not what we want to do. We want people to tell us true accounts of their experiences and their feelings, their wants, their behaviors. And so what we typically do is, in the case of an incentive, we make sure that it's not necessarily, ideally not monetary, but it may be a voucher or a gift of sort that's not too exorbitant, but within means and reasonable for what we're asking them to do, and that we also give it to them at the beginning. The reason why we give it at the beginning of the interview is that all the behaviors around trying to tell you what you want to hear with the view to get the incentive at the end of that interview gets negated. That gets sorted out right in the beginning. So that person is at ease. They've already received their incentive, and that can be put aside, and we can focus on the interview itself. Then we have capture sheets, and these are typically help us to take our observations and write it down, categorize it, and when we're doing the synthesis, helps us to bring all that together in a structured manner. It's important to get your capture sheet sorted beforehand to cover the key areas that you wanna cover and that you wanna have covered in the interview. Every observation or capture sheet will be different depending on what the opportunity space or problem space is that you're looking at and that you're discussing. So there might be key topics or key features or themes that you want covered, and maybe your capture sheet helps you highlight those. But super critical to structure the way you annotate and the way you capture your research data and the annotations from what you either observing or what you're getting from the interview. Then there's also room to maybe just quickly mention remote research. We've used DScout in the past, and it's been particularly useful, again, when you're trying to get a closer glimpse into people's day-to-day. And the one example I want to mention was for a major bank in South Africa. We used DScout to recruit, I think it was about 40 millennials in their early 20s. And DScout allowed us to ask them things like taking a photo while they're out and about and in a mall, or give us a photo of their favorite item in their cupboard. And so it's a form of ethnographic research that allows you to get that valuable information, get a glimpse into people's day-to-day lives without actually, of course, needing to be there where they are. And in the case of 40 participants, it's nearly impossible to do that. But it really enabled us to get a lot of valuable information around the aspirations, the brands, the shopping patterns of millennials, which is very interesting. So maybe just a quick word on interviews. I think the main thing here is not to ask leading questions. A typical leading question is, do you think that this brand gives a good service? So that's a leading question, because for one, you put good in there as I guess an adjective in terms of tainting the question itself, and then the question is also expecting a yes or no answer, which doesn't give you much in terms of data to work from. Ideally, you want questions that don't give you a yes or no answer. You want to give questions that enable the interviewee or the participant to explore or elaborate. A good example is, give me a sense of your experience with this brand or service, or tell me why you think that way, as a follow-up question. And then what I've also found is that sometimes interviewers will preempt an answer or even complete the question for the participant, which of course again inhibits you from getting to the right answer, and even stifles the conversation. So it's at best inhibiting, and at worst it's even it's inhibiting the conversation, and at worst it's even preventing you from getting to the right answer. And then as I said, it's important to ask why and dig deeper when the moment arises. And those moments do arise where the participant gives you a clue, or would give you a sense that there's something deeper that's motivating them to have a good or a bad view around the service. And then it's important to dig deeper or ask why. What we find also is, specifically when you talk about products and services that are digital, and in our world, in my work, we live in the digital world, and we work with a lot of technical people. So the language that we use from a day-to-day basis in the business sense can be, I guess, obscure and not understood by a lot of people. So when you're interviewing people, it's important to also be cognizant of the fact that your world may not be the same as theirs, and that the language you're using in interviewing or talking to people should be plain enough for them to understand and not get too technical. Sometimes participants pause, or they go silent to think a bit, and then it's important to allow them the space to do that. We often get tempted to fill the blanks or the voids or the silences with our own voice, or move on to the next question. But it's important to honor those silences, because often, more often than not, what follows the silence is a really insightful observation or comment, precisely because they've taken the time to really find the words to articulate it. And in that sense, it's allowing the space, allowing the time for them to do that. And then while you're going, it's important to start seeing the patterns. And usually you start seeing patterns after about 5 or 6 of these interviews. You start seeing certain patterns keep coming up. And then, so while you're interviewing and post-interview, start noting these things. And in this sense, maybe the one that I want to also say is that it's important to interview ideally in pairs, because what we like to do is have the one person conduct the interview and the other person take the notes, observe and annotate while the interview is happening. It can get distracting in conducting the interview and at the same time annotating. So what we either do is we ask the person permission to record the interview, and then we capture or digitize that recording later on and type out the key or salient points, or we have someone in the interview with the interviewee that annotates and takes notes while the interview is being conducted. But it's super important to be present, and the main part here is active listening, so that you can actually absorb what the person is telling you and be present and ask the right follow-up questions as the interview progresses. So that's the first half. I'm hoping that we're in a good space. It's 1:15. Maybe we'll need to reduce it with about 5 minutes or so. I'm hoping that was useful in terms of just tending to that, the first half of the 4-step process of design thinking. I'm wondering if there's any questions, or you guys, I'm happy to answer any questions at this stage. And then maybe we take a short break.
Hi, Marcel.
Hello?
First and foremost, I think you're killing it. The chat has really been going off while you have been delivering your first half of the lecture.
I'm so sorry, I can't see the chat.
Yeah, I'm just going to share some of the comments.
Wait.
Can you see on your side?
Wait. Okay, here it is. Sorry.
Okay.
I've been missing it all along. Okay, cool.
So I'll just let you have a chance to go through all of that and maybe provide feedback or comment on some of the points that have been raised in the chat.
Okay, cool. Cool. I'm glad you guys like the qualitative versus quantitative approach. How do I avoid confirmation bias when working with smaller sets of data, especially when approaching the research using a qualitative data framework? I think it's always important to substantiate your data with other data sources. There's always a risk of taking a smaller set of data and assuming that that's the truth. And it's a tricky one because you don't always have other data sources to substantiate what you're looking at, Sibusiso. But I think confirmation bias also comes with understanding what your own assumptions are. And in doing any research, it's super important to keep that in mind. And again, it's not the easiest thing to do in isolation. In a team, good, robust debate is always a very useful tool because it helps you interrogate the data together and collaboratively confirm and identify potential biases that would help you or that would potentially taint your view. And so a very diverse group, I always believe that diversity is, and good design goes hand in hand. So your data and looking at your data, diverse views and inflection points on that data and on that research is always going to help you understand it better and eliminate any potential biases. And further down the line, a diverse group of people will also, as I mentioned earlier, help you come to better ideas because you'll have people coming in again from different and new kind of viewpoints. 5 whys, yeah, absolutely. That's a super useful tool when interrogating the data and trying to understand what you're looking at. Cool. Did you guys sort out the audio issues? Sorry, I'm only seeing that now.
Yeah, audio is all good. Marcel, I wanted to pass a comment. It's, just to understand, it seems that with design thinking, intuition is important, but you also have to be led by the data and your observation. So I'm just trying to understand, how do you balance that intuitiveness and saying that maybe because of my background or my context or just how I've developed in my experience against what the data is necessarily communicating? How do you approach that or deal with that? Do you allow yourself to be led by your intuition, or do you always look for the answers in the data set?
I don't think it's a tricky one because I don't think you can separate the person from the researcher or the person from the objective observer. There'll always be a part of you that's looking at the data, but intuition is a funny thing. It can be a tool to make connections and make leaps, as we say in reasoning, and coming to a great solution. But especially in the beginning, I think it's important to keep a neutral stance, and even in unpacking the data, be super aware of not judging and not even coming to any conclusions initially. Just look at the themes of what the data is telling you. Your intuition will come to use later when you start ideating, but I think especially in the, there's some things that your intuition is there in the beginning to help you look for more or deeper insight, but it's not a tool to judge or to start making conclusions yet. It's a tool to that will help you identify where to dig deeper. And I think that's where intuition comes into play, especially at this stage. Later on, your intuition will be of use when you start making leaps and ideating. But at this stage, something may tell you to dig deeper in a certain area because you've got a feeling something's there, or you don't quite understand why, and the 5 whys is a way to do that in a kind of an objective way. So yeah, intuition is still important, but it's not for judging or making conclusions. It's for following your nose to where those gold nuggets are that you're trying to get to.
No, thank you so much for that. Appreciate it. So just to everybody, we will be taking is it 10 or 15 minutes, Marcel?
I said 15 minutes, but I want to ask if we can do it 10 because we're gonna run out of a bit of time. And the last bit, I will need a bit, at least like, we're already kind of short of time. So if we can do like 10 minutes, is that okay?
Yeah, okay, so it's 23 minutes past 1. If most people could be back by 1:30, just after 1:30, and then we can kick off the part 2 of the session, that would be really great. So everybody just take a quick 10-minute break, and then we'll see you back just after 1:30.
Cool, thanks, Will.
Thank you so much for everybody who's tuned in. It's really been amazing.
Alrighty. A new way, reframing what we're looking at and coming up with new and novel solutions. And that's the last part, the wisdom part of maturing our view of what we're solving for. So I talked a lot about mapping and modeling, but before you start mapping and modeling and doing journey work, it's important that you start sorting and organizing the data itself. So a lot of the times it's lifting out the themes that's coming out of the research, identifying what are the commonalities between those different data points and clustering them together. A lot of the time we call that affinity mapping. So we're taking what we're seeing, we're trying to reduce the complexity, lift out the key themes that we see out of the data, and in a way already start prioritizing what our focus area should be. And then it's about making sense or making it tangible, and that predominantly looks at the relations between these things, starting to map them out in terms of hierarchy. Sometimes that is the way information or content is organized, or what's the most important thing to focus on. And then look at also sometimes the dynamics between different parts. Where are there exchanges or flow of information between different parts of the business, for instance? And very often when we talk about journey mapping, it's about key moments or touch points. And again, zooming in and out and looking at the bigger picture. That means in what context does sometimes in what context does a service or product get used versus the actual moment itself and what's contained in that interaction. So a lot of the times at this stage also, once we've made sense of the research, we get into a workshop mode and we start looking at what the research is telling us with other people. And that includes sometimes our clients, main stakeholders, and also sometimes the customers themselves. So once we've made sense of what we're looking at, we like to take that into a co-creative workshop and take those main themes and start exploring it together. It helps the participants, the people involved in the co-creative exercise to form a collective understanding and agree on what the focus area should be, and co-create around a possible solution. But it's really about, first and foremost, understanding the data itself. I mentioned affinity mapping. So this is really where stickies come in handy. If you start exploring the main points coming out of the data, stickies help you to, again, take the main points, write them down on a sticky, put them on a wall, and start organizing them or clustering them according to what are the main themes. And so the end result of an affinity diagramming or affinity mapping session should be a subset of 5 or 6 main themes that are well understood by everybody that have been involved in interrogating the data. And those themes are typically the things that you look to solve for. So affinity mapping is a very useful exercise to do in a group as you are interrogating the data. And usually it happens at the point where we've come back from our research activity. We're now sitting in a room, we unpacking and putting all the data points out there and starting to see where the commonalities are. So a very important exercise to start highlighting key themes. I talked about empathy earlier, but also here it's where the point where we start really trying to understand what we're seeing in terms of who we're trying to solve for. And a lot of it involves stepping into the shoes of that person and understanding what their worlds are all about. I'm going to talk about empathy maps in a minute, but sometimes we also do, and many times it evolves into what we call an archetype or a persona or a fictional representation of who we're trying to solve for. So what does that look like in terms of evoking empathy and making the person who we're trying to solve for a bit more real? This is an example of an empathy map. And by the way, these worksheets I'm going to be making available, and I'm going to share it with Holo, who's going to distribute it to the various teams so that you have it on hand and you can work with these sheets to inform your own research and synthesis and design activities. But empathy map is a great place to start in understanding who you're wanting to solve for. Obviously, we want to give this person a name and a face, and so it's important to, in a sense, make the person tangible, and then start working at the different aspects of that person, including what are the key things that they're trying to do. Those are the tasks, and what are the things that they need answered or solved. It's the doing part. Then if you move clockwise, it's also about the things that inform their decision or influence their decision in a way. A lot of it is to do with places and context. If I'm in a rush or I'm trying to commute between places, my decision making is going to be different as opposed to when I'm relaxed and sitting on my couch, and I've got all the time in the world. All these things influence people's decision making and how they see or use a certain product or service. Then the tasks that they do or the doing ultimately needs to lead to a goal or an ultimate thing that needs to be achieved, whether that is getting to work on time or getting that home loan. The ultimate goal is the end point, is where that person's aiming for, and understanding what that the importance of that. And then it is about the emotional side of things and the pain points that people struggled with in wanting to and going through the motions of trying to achieve what they want to do. So again, all this stuff should be informed and influenced by the research and the interviews that we do, so that we can capture all this on the empathy map, and we start shaping a persona or a person, a fictional person that can represent all these things. Again, it helps us develop empathy for who we're solving for. It helps us bring all the data points together in a tangible way, in a distilled way that we can take forward and take into consideration when we start solutioning. I mentioned personas, and I'm sure, again, many of you may have run across or come across or even created personas yourself. So a persona is exactly that. It comes from the Greek word, which means mask, or it's a fictional representation. Actually, in Greek theater, a persona was the mask that you put on in a play. And so in this instance, it is a fictional person. It's a person that we make up to represent who we're trying to solve for. Typically, it's got quantitative data in there. So we do have age. We sometimes include a LSM or an income bracket, but also combined with that is typical behaviors in this instance, in this example, doing business or people's proficiency with technology. And also critically, what's important for them in terms of getting things done. What are the frequent tasks they are busy with? What associations or groups are they involved in? What are their worries and the things that keep them up at night, and their wants and need states, and how do we solve for that? So you can see that where the empathy map is kind of a loose arrangement of and starting to shape something, the persona starts formalizing that into something that's a little bit more, I guess, structured, and ultimately helps us take that to any stakeholder or someone that is keen to understand who we're trying to solve for. And then you'll see that there are these kind of tags associated with each of these personas. For Natalia, it's security, continuity, cost effectiveness, and support. And for Phililani, it's knowledge and being knowledgeable, mobile and efficient and flexible. So those are, again, themes. And these themes aren't just dreamt up. They come from the research. They come from the interviews and the conversations we've had. And again, the affinity mapping that I mentioned earlier, all this stuff serves to inform this view of a persona and who we're trying to solve for. So mapping and modeling, again, as I mentioned, can take on different forms, but it helps us to understand, again, what we're trying to solve for. If the persona is the who, the mapping and particularly journey mapping is the what and the particular moments. And often it's about telling a story and making real these key moments, the feelings, the pain points, the goals that people are concerned with during those key moments. And it helps us to focus and hone in on what we need to solve for. So mapping is an interesting part for me. I find it very interesting because I do believe that mapping can have different shapes and sizes. A linear map, like a journey map, shows you how someone goes from A to B to C to D in completing a journey or completing a task. And it's typically time-based. So you could say that it's sequential. But you also have other maps like a stakeholder map or ecosystem map, which shows you the relations between different parts of a business or even different individuals or people, or even different pieces of information. And so there you can start articulating how these things fit together. And what I like to say is that any problem or opportunity space, depending on what you're looking at, might have or necessitate a different way of making it real or mapping it out. And it really depends on the story you're trying to tell, or, based on the synthesis that you've done, what are the key points you're trying to highlight here, and who's your audience? So for me, this is a fun part of design, is simplifying and making tangible what we're looking at. And then lastly, the systematic mapping is typically a logical flow of things. So this is, if you're in the technical field, this is a task flow or screen flow. The diamond in the middle of this example here is typically where a decision gets made, and then a logical flow branches out to another set of processes or logical steps to be followed. But that certainly is a map in itself. So what we always always look to do is humanize the story itself. So we use storyboarding to tell the story, typically also at the beginning of this kind of synthesis or describing exercise. Before we get into a more structured journey map and the more abstract representations of a person's experience, a storyboard is a great example to tell exactly that. Tell a story of how a person goes through the steps of using a service. What do they struggle with? Who do they interact with? What time of day? What artifacts do they use? And how do they kind of step through a process of getting something done using a service or a product? So a storyboard is kind of a loose and narrative way of telling that story. But then obviously journey mapping takes it to a more structured level, where we start really articulating a few key things that's important for us to understand in making this product or service real. It includes who's involved. It includes the channels that are being used, and that can be mobile, online, desktop. It can even include a branch experience or a call center. And then it involves the emotional status of that person as they go through this journey, the amount of time spent in getting something done or getting through a certain moment, how frequent, and also what's interesting in this example is the attention span of that person at a particular moment in time. And then in the solutioning phase, we use this journey to start articulating the to-be state or the ideal state. And I want to touch on that a little bit. So if we talk about journey mapping, there are usually two different ones. One is the as-is journey, and that's what we're looking at now. It's the stuff that we're wanting to solve for. And as I've highlighted here, it's the needs and the pain points of someone at a specific moment in time. And so if a journey map is about highlighting different stages of a person's progression through the use of a service and the tasks that they do at every stage. In this case, we're focusing on the buying stage, and the task at hand is seeing if I'm eligible for a specific package. The need and pain point that we've highlighted here is that the customer is struggling to understand the differences between the packages and, in fact, what they qualify for. And then a lot of the times, we also try and articulate what's happening behind the scenes or below the line of visibility. What is the stuff happening in the background that the customer or the user doesn't see, but that is actually very key in where something may fail or succeed in how a service is brought to life. So the as-is journey predominantly looks to highlight those needs and those pain points. And then in the subsequent phase, where we start ideating, we start concepting around features or feature stories. Sometimes we extrapolate them into feature stories that can be used to build out our service or our product. And in this case, it's an eligibility tool that queries the person's eligibility for a product and kind of automates that whole process and makes it easier for them. So it's important to note that at this stage of the design process, you are looking to articulate the as-is state. You're describing what you're looking at in terms of the problem opportunity space. Later on down the line, you maybe want to articulate a to-be state or the ideal state when you go into the ideation phase. I wanted to throw this in here because I thought it was a nice thought. The Dewey Decimal System, of course, is a map or model in itself. It's the way we make sense of books and categorize books. And so in the digital realm, we do a lot of this. We start organizing and categorizing content. This is the information architecture for Airbnb's website. And it shows you how different sections are organized in the website and arranged. Again, this can be an articulation of how things are currently as it is, and in future, how we'd like the information or the world to look like going forward, knowing what we know and having gone through the ideation stage. So I just thought it'd be cool to just touch on that. The next stage within Describe is finding the insights. So, and it really focuses on pain points, the needs and wants of our customers or our users, and what they're trying to get done ultimately. Again, the research needs to, and is typically pivotal in identifying what these are. So it's extracting these pain points, needs and wants and goals from the research and finding out what we need to solve for, and then articulating it in a way so that we can take it into an ideation stage with a kind of clarity around what we need to solve for. And there's a couple of ways to do this. The one is creating a point of view. So if you think about your persona that we looked at earlier, you might want to put an articulation of an insight together in the following manner. If you're saying that Ruth is our persona, Ruth typically will need a need or will have a need associated with her. So you can say Ruth needs to, and then the need or goal. So in this case, let's use our example of a journey here and say Ruth needs to find out if she's eligible for a package because she wants to apply for an iPhone 10, and she is not sure about whether her budget actually allows for it. So the need is that Ruth wants to apply for an iPhone 10, but the insight is that Ruth is actually nervous because she's not sure whether her budget allows for it. And that already starts informing you in terms of what you're actually solving for. You're not solving for Ruth needing an iPhone 10. You're solving for the fact that Ruth is not sure whether her budget allows for it. And that key insight is what you take into your ideation phase. It starts showing you how you narrow down your focus going into ideation. And what we often do after this is if we say that is the insight around what we're solving for, we start creating how might we statements. I'm wondering if we still got time. I'm not going to play the video. I'm going to give you a link to it. It's a fantastic video from Clay Christensen around jobs to be done. It's a great way to frame how you should look at understanding what to solve for. And it might not always be as apparent as you think. But ultimately, you want to get to a how might we statement that helps you focus on the key opportunity or challenge. And a how might we statement is again informed by the synthesis of the research and those insights that you've extracted from it. Typically, it looks like this. A how might we statement might look like, let's say we're looking at solutioning in the area of travel. We could say, how might we make the airport a place that kids would want to go to? Or in the area of food, how might we make healthy eating appealing to young females? Or in the area of content subscription, how might we make our content catalog easily understandable so that anyone can find what they need? And that's so that I highlight it because if you want to extend your how might we statement a little bit, the so that can help contextualize what you're trying to solve for, and just extend it a little bit, which is a useful tool sometimes. But it starts with the insight, and the insight informs your how might we statement and helps frame that so that going into ideation, the how might we statement is super important because it will help your group focus. It will help you ensure that you're not going too broad and that everybody has agreement on what we're actually trying to solve for. And so it almost needs to be up on a banner somewhere so that everybody can be reminded on what we're trying to solve for. The last thing I want to maybe just mention is that IDEO's got a great online resource called designkit.org. It's got a whole bunch of articles and assets and other things in there that you can use in your ongoing exploration of the design process and applying it in your different streams. So I would encourage you to look at that. And then tomorrow we'll look at taking those insights and the how might we statements and how that informs ideas and ultimately how you take those ideas to concepts and prototyping and the different flavors of that. So I'm going to end it there. I really hope I see you guys tomorrow. We have a couple minute or so. I don't know if there are any questions at this stage.
Hi, Marcel. Thank you so much for that. Really, really informative. I think from my end, it's really just first and foremost the framing of design thinking, human-centered design. At least the understanding that there are different approaches to it in terms of how the process. I really enjoyed you just differentiating at the different processes and that we are going through the British, you'll correct me, the British format. So I don't see any questions. Okay, could you please just explain the stakeholder map again? That is from Innocent. Innocent, okay. Where are you from? You can just text in the group, but they asked for the stakeholder map to be explained.
Sure. Let me just quickly go back. The stakeholders map, I don't have an example in here, but I mentioned it as a
Hi, Marcel. Also, Innocent is from Cameroon, so she's joining in from Cameroon.
Hi, Innocent. Yeah, so the stakeholder map is basically, if you're looking at an organization and different players within an organization, what I was trying to say here is that a relational map shows you how the different people within an organization and even outside of an organization relate to one another. A stakeholder map often helps you understand who are the key people that you need to solve for and how do they relate to one another. So one guy might be the accountant and he might have different needs than the developer guy, but they're both working on the same product or service. And in that sense, if you look at your personas, a stakeholder map helps you put those different personas in relation to one another and understand what are their interactions and how do you solve for them as a collective, which ones are more important than others. And also you can start showing how certain stakeholders are more central or closer to the service or product and others may sit on the periphery and maybe less influential in helping shape your service or product. So in that sense, it starts giving you a sense of how these different stakeholders interact, which are more important, and what are the need states in relation to one another, and exchanges between and relations between these different stakeholders. I hope that kind of explained it.
And then there's a follow-up question. Are there some tools that can help design stakeholder maps, and are there different types? So I think that's obviously the design kit, right?
Yeah, I would encourage you looking at that design kit, but the stakeholder map is very simple. If you take, usually your main customer or user is at the center of you can think of it as a target or like a circular map. At the center of that circle is the person you're trying to solve for. And then usually the process is, okay, well, who has the most contact or is the most important in serving that person? It may be the call center person or the branch person, or it may even be a sales agent. And so you start placing these people in that circular format around your main user or customer or person you're trying to solve for. And that can be done using stickies, or just drawing that circle, that circular concentric circles on a large piece of paper. I always advise for paper in doing these initial exercises, and just placing these little stickies in relation to that central person or that person you're trying to solve for. And then again, having discussions amongst each other and getting to agreement in terms of who within that stakeholder map are the most influential or most important in solving for that customer or that persona.
Thank you so much, Marcel. I think also just to add on that, if I understand correctly, in the context of our GLAM partners and our GLAM stakeholders, we obviously have the public as beneficiaries, of people who visit or engage with our different GLAM institutions. But would our GLAM institutions be at the center of this particular stakeholder map? Would that be the target?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think I would say no. I would say the person that is using and is the biggest proponent or user of your GLAM institutions, the GLAM institution's client or customer, that would be the person that I would put at the center.
Okay.
And then say, okay, as a GLAM institution, how do we pivot or change or look at the roles of the individuals inside the GLAM, inside the institution and outside, and how do they help this person achieve what they need to do? How can we bring our archivist closer to the person trying to get to the information? Or how do we get our librarians to have a more personal relationship with someone that goes to a library regularly? Those are just like two fictional examples.
And everybody, please note, Marcel and his partner, Keith, I think Keith is also on this call, they will be doing coaching sessions this Saturday, the 10th of October, and on Saturday, the 17th of October. So you will have the opportunity to engage with them in more detail in regards to the development of your project, and ask them more specific questions like this one in regards to how that you could improve your particular design process as you guys develop solutions for the respective GLAM institutions. But with no more questions in the chat, Marcel, I just want to extend our thanks on behalf of Hacker Culture. The session was really, really informative and really, really engaging. And we can't wait to hear what you have to say tomorrow.
Great. Thanks, Kholo. I appreciate the opportunity, and I hope to see you guys tomorrow.
Yeah. And if you guys are in the hackers, please tell your colleagues and your fellow hackers what they are missing out on, and tell them to join in the live sessions. They are really, really informative. To everybody, I just want to wish you guys an awesome day. Take care, and we will speak to you on the Discord. Thank you so much, Marcel. Goodbye, everybody.
Cheers, everybody. Have a good one.